Quad City Bay Area, thank you for a $5 super chat. I think I made a mistake. DJI has the better system and better testers than Walksnail. I mean, there's reasons to pick Walksnail over DJI. Chris Rosser did an interesting test. Let me try and like maybe make you feel better. Chris Rosser did a test. This was really interesting. He did a test where on the bench he had a variable resistor that caused a certain amount of loss to the signal in a controllable way. And he measured, you can watch this whole video if you want. He measured the performance of each of these systems as the resistance went up, as the loss went up. It's not a resistor, it's dB loss. And what you see here, and this is like the equivalent of additional distance. What you see here is that as the distance goes up, the avatar drops in its bit rate, but its latency is remarkably consistent. Right up until the end, and then it falls apart. Okay? Whereas with DJI, the bit rate also drops off, and the latency is always a little bit noisy. Right? The latency is not as consistent. Now, the DJI O3, this is the O3, yeah. The DJI O3 does a better job overall because even at the maximum attenuation, it never fully drops the link and the latency keeps going. So, like, way better range and penetration overall. But look at the consistency on the Walksnail. Incredibly consistent. Yeah, Blunty.
Do we believe that log?
That's a very good question. I actually asked Chris that. And he said he believes it. He said he validated that latency number and found it to be accurate.
I would like to see points of data because I don't believe it. I really don't believe it.
I hear you. I am also skeptical, but I also have Chris is no dummy. I mean, not that you're saying he is.
And latency doesn't move for so long. Look at how long that gap is with no bitrate and no latency change at all. I mean, yeah, I don't know, man.
I agree. It's pretty like holding the bitrate, sure, but if you're going to hold the bitrate absolutely rock steady, then shouldn't the latency be sort of adjusting because of dropped packets? What Chris said was, hang on, let me switch back to, let me pull up his conversation, but I'm going to just make sure that there's no private conversations going on at the same time. Before I put it on stream, I'll show you what he said. How do I do this? I don't know how I would do this. Can I close that window? No? All right, I'm going to just screen grab it. That's what I'm going to do. Here we go. So here's the conversation I had with Chris about this. I said, that's pretty suspicious. Any network link is going to have variable latency, especially one where packets get lost. And he says, unless you build in a buffer, if you leave space for some retransmits, you can achieve fixed latency until the signal gets really bad. And I think that's what they're doing. I said, it's interesting how stable the Walksnail bitrate is right up until they reach a threshold. Yes, it looks like rather than varying the bitrate dynamically, they have fixed modes they switch between. They seem to err on the cautious side and preserve link latency by dropping to lower bit rates sooner than DJI. And then also...
So, okay, let me just clarify then. So what he's saying is they've somehow locked latency by sacrificing quality.
They drop to lower bit, right. They're dropping to lower bit rates sooner. I would make a distinction between quality and bit rate, since one image can have better quality than another, even at the same bit rate. But I don't think that's what you meant. But yeah,
Right.
he thinks they're dropping to a lower bit rate sooner to preserve latency.
Interesting.
Yeah, indeed. So he said, and he also says, I say, okay, hang on, I'll screen grab this. Here we go. I'll screen grab this one too. So I said, the results are super interesting. Do you really believe the Walksnail reported latency? And he said, yes, I do. The glass-to-glass is consistently a little more than reported link latency by about 2 milliseconds. And I said, I thought I remembered it being more. And he's like, nope. It's really interesting how much more consistent it is than DJI. He is just confident in those numbers that it is consistent in a way that DJI is not.
Well, if we remember, back in the original Walksnail issues were horribly varying latency. You know, like we saw a lie in the OSD, we saw like a locked MS in the OSD, but when you looked at the logs were correct and showing a crazy high amount of variable latency. So it is interesting to see that now that's not the case. Maybe it is the case that they spent a lot of work to block that and make it not look bad in those logs, right?
But here's what I would say in response to that. And like, it's always the challenge. Like, Chris's test is a bench test where he has an attenuator, and it's perfectly repeatable and perfectly controllable, but also doesn't necessarily reflect the real world. However, the real world isn't repeatable and controllable. So, like, I kind of wonder if we would see this consistent latency in the real world the way that Chris is showing on the bench. It doesn't feel like I have seen that in the real world.
Well, for instance, we're not like simulating multiple reflection environments, right? And we're not looking at like antennas in different directions, and like there's a lot of things that can happen. You know, we're also there's only one thing connected there. OFDM.
Yeah,
maybe
so
he's
blocked off the second antenna. Who knows what the O3 would do if it was able to use both antennas at once? However, like, he would need 2 attenuators for that, which I guess he could do. But so he acknowledges some of this here in this, where he says RF power measurement is hard, and he talks about his test setup. There's always going to be criticisms of this test setup, but I think it interestingly demonstrates some fundamental differences in how Walksnail and DJI approach the degradation of the link as range increases. And that result in and of itself is interesting. There's ways in which Walksnail potentially is better than DJI in terms of its ability to hold latency, and maybe that's something you care about.
Okay, one more thing I want to say is the only thing we can't tell by our analysis. Like, he can do glass to glass, but we don't know if they're relying on the bitrate. Right, so like in just a world where we would consider if the logs are correct or not, or if they're doing something to fudge results, and they knew people were checking latency numbers, they could instead fudge results for bitrate. Like, they could say, hey, it's 50 megabits, but it's actually like we're compressing it and whatever.
They could. Nope. I don't know how we would know that whether they were doing that.
Yeah, just thinking out loud.
Yeah. All right. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that they are doing that. Just Blunty, I think you're just fishing around for potentials.
Pontificating.
Pontificating.